They returned to familiar streets, familiar language, and familiar faces. Yet something felt fundamentally wrong, because what happens when men come back to a world that looks the same but no longer feels like it belongs to them? When home offers no sense of arrival, and when the place they waited years to reach feels more distant than the camp they survived. At first glance, everything appeared unchanged because the streets still followed the same paths, the language still carried familiar sounds, and the outlines of daily life looked recognizable enough to suggest continuity. Yet beneath this surface familiarity, the men sensed an absence that was difficult to name, as if something essential had failed to return with them. Home existed physically, but emotionally it no longer offered the sense of arrival they had imagined during captivity. The men noticed that movement through familiar spaces felt tentative, because those spaces no longer guided behavior the way they once had. Before the war, home had provided orientation, expectations, and belonging, but now it felt neutral, offering no clear signals about how to act or where to place oneself. The routines that once defined daily life had dissolved, and without them, even familiar environments felt uncertain. They became aware that time had not paused during their absence, because lives had continued, roles had shifted, and priorities had changed without waiting for them to return. Conversations reflected this change subtly, as references were made to events, experiences, and adjustments the men had not shared. Listening became easier than speaking, because speaking required catching up to a reality that had moved forward independently. The men sensed that others expected recognition, gratitude, or relief, and when these emotions did not surface naturally, a quiet distance formed. The return was assumed to be restorative, a closing of a painful chapter, yet the men did not experience closure. Instead, they felt suspended between what they had endured and what they were expected to resume, unable to connect the two seamlessly. Home demanded reintegration without acknowledging transformation, because it assumed continuity where none existed. The men struggled to explain their hesitation, as the language of survival did not translate easily into ordinary conversation. What had once been meaningful inside the camp now felt irrelevant outside it, and this disconnect deepened the sense of being out of place. The absence of structure was particularly unsettling, because captivity had provided clear limits and expectations, while home offered openness without guidance. Inside the camp, identity had been simplified, but at home, complexity returned abruptly. The men were expected to resume roles they no longer understood how to inhabit, and this expectation created quiet pressure rather than comfort. They noticed that familiar places no longer triggered memory in the same way, because memory had been reshaped by confinement. The person they remembered being before the war felt distant, and the person they had become did not fit easily into the spaces waiting for them. Home no longer functioned as a reference point, but as a reminder of a version of themselves that felt unreachable. This realization did not produce anger or rejection, but confusion, because confusion offered no clear response. The men moved carefully, conserving energy as they had learned to do, observing rather than participating fully. What had once been a survival strategy now shaped their return, limiting engagement and reinforcing the sense of separation. By the end of this phase, it became clear that returning home did not restore belonging automatically, because belonging required alignment between internal experience and external expectation. The men understood that the camp had not only removed them from home physically, but had altered the way home would feel upon return, leaving them present yet emotionally displaced in the very place they had waited so long to reach. Many people who enjoy these stories watch on television. Subscribing helps make sure the next story appears automatically. As the days passed after their return, The men began to sense that the world around them was moving according to expectations they no longer understood, because normal life assumed continuity, while their experience had created a rupture that could not be easily explained. People spoke to them as if time had merely paused, as if endurance alone was enough to resume what had been interrupted, and this assumption quietly deepened the distance they already felt. They noticed that conversations often moved quickly past the war, treating it as a closed chapter rather than a defining experience. Questions were asked briefly and answered even more briefly, not out of cruelty, but out of a shared desire to move forward. The men understood this impulse, yet felt unable to follow it, because moving forward required an internal readiness that had not returned with them. Social interactions began to feel performative, shaped by expectations of gratitude, relief, and visible recovery. When these responses did not appear naturally, the men sensed subtle discomfort in others, as if their presence disrupted the idea that survival automatically led to healing. To avoid causing unease, they simplified their reactions, offering neutral expressions and measured words that concealed confusion rather than resolved it. Work and responsibility returned quickly, bringing with them assumptions about motivation and direction. The men were expected to engage, to plan, and to invest themselves in future-oriented tasks. Yet their internal reference point remained anchored in survival rather than aspiration. Effort was expended carefully, because effort without clear meaning felt wasteful after years of conserving energy. They became aware that society valued initiative and decisiveness, qualities that captivity had quietly suppressed. Inside the camp, waiting had been adaptive, while outside, waiting appeared as hesitation or lack of ambition. This mismatch created friction, not through confrontation, but through misunderstanding, as others interpreted restraint as disinterest rather than adaptation. The men found it easier to remain on the margins of interaction, observing rather than participating fully, because observation demanded less explanation. Participation required confidence in roles they no longer trusted themselves to inhabit. Silence once again became a refuge, not because it offered safety, but because it reduced the need to reconcile incompatible expectations. They sensed that their internal tempo no longer aligned with the pace of ordinary life, because captivity had taught them to move slowly, deliberately, and without anticipation. Outside, speed and momentum were assumed, and this contrast amplified the feeling of being out of place. The men adjusted outwardly, but internally they remained cautious, measuring each step against habits formed under confinement. Over time, this quiet misalignment began to shape identity, as the men questioned where they fit within a world that seemed to require emotional responses they could not summon on demand. They were not rejecting society, but they felt unseen by it, because the transformation they carried was invisible and difficult to articulate. By the end of this phase, it became clear that the challenge of return was not hostility or rejection, but expectation itself. The world expected normality, continuity, and readiness to move forward, while the men were still learning how to exist outside survival. This gap, unspoken yet persistent, reinforced the sense that returning home had placed them in a position where they were present physically, but psychologically out of sync with the life that awaited them. As time passed, the men began to understand that belonging was no longer something granted automatically by place, language, or shared history, but something that now felt conditional, dependent on how well they could perform normality. Returning home had not restored a sense of inclusion, because inclusion required alignment with expectations they could not fully meet. They noticed that acceptance seemed tied to visible progress, to signs that they were moving forward, rebuilding, and reintegrating as expected. When these signs did not appear clearly, the men sensed subtle shifts in how others related to them, not through rejection, but through distance that suggested discomfort rather than hostility. Belonging appeared available, but only if they could adapt quickly enough. This realization intensified the internal struggle because it introduced pressure to become someone they no longer recognized. The men felt torn between honoring the reality of what they had lived through and conforming to a version of themselves that others found easier to understand. This tension created a quiet conflict, one that played out internally rather than through confrontation. They became increasingly aware that their experiences had reshaped how they understood value and purpose. Inside the camp, meaning had been reduced to survival, endurance, and the careful management of energy. Outside, meaning was expected to come from ambition, productivity, and future planning, concepts that felt distant and abstract after years of suspended life. Attempts to reconnect with former identities often felt incomplete, as if the roles they were expected to resume belonged to someone else. The men moved through familiar social spaces with a sense of detachment, aware that they were present, but not fully integrated. Participation required emotional investment that felt risky because investing in a future once again exposed them to uncertainty. They found themselves questioning where they truly belonged, not in a dramatic or existential sense, but through quiet moments of doubt that accumulated over time. Home no longer offered a clear answer, and the camp, despite its confinement, had at least provided a shared reality where expectations were limited and predictable. This comparison unsettled them because it challenged assumptions about freedom and belonging. The camp had removed choice, but it had also removed ambiguity, while freedom restored choice without resolving ambiguity. The men struggled to reconcile this contradiction, as it threatened the belief that return alone would restore a sense of place. As belonging became something to be earned rather than assumed, the men grew more cautious in how they presented themselves. They minimized discussion of the past, avoided drawing attention to internal conflict, and adopted outward behaviors that suggested adjustment, even when internal alignment was missing. This self-monitoring required effort, adding another layer of fatigue to daily life. By the end of this phase, the men recognized that the hardest part of return was not rebuilding relationships or routines, but negotiating a sense of belonging that now depended on performance rather than shared experience. They were no longer defined by captivity, yet they were not fully accepted as unchanged members of the world they had left behind, leaving them suspended between survival and reintegration, still searching for a place that felt unconditionally theirs. As the pressure to belong continued quietly, the men began to notice that the deepest conflict was no longer with society, but with themselves, because the internal reference points they once relied on no longer felt stable or trustworthy. Decisions that required confidence now triggered hesitation, not because options were unclear, but because the sense of self that once guided choice felt unfamiliar. They realized that captivity had trained them to measure their worth through survival rather than expression, through endurance rather than direction. Inside the camp, identity had been simplified to function, and that simplification had been protective. Outside, however, identity demanded complexity again, asking them to define who they were, what they wanted, and where they intended to go without offering the structure that had once made such questions manageable. This gap created a subtle erosion of confidence, as the men questioned whether their instincts could still be trusted. Reactions felt delayed, emotions arrived muted or out of sequence, and certainty seemed harder to access. The men did not feel broken in a visible way, yet they sensed that something essential no longer responded as it once had, making even ordinary situations feel slightly unstable. They became cautious with themselves, avoiding strong commitments or decisive actions, because commitment required belief in continuity, and continuity had been disrupted by years of suspended life. The future no longer appeared as an extension of the present, but as an unfamiliar territory that demanded navigation skills they had not practiced. Memories of the camp resurfaced, not as trauma in the conventional sense, but as a point of comparison, because within confinement, expectations had been clear and identity had been contained. The men were unsettled by the realization that they sometimes felt more internally coherent during captivity than they did in freedom. Not because captivity had been preferable, but because it had reduced the burden of self-definition. This realization carried quiet guilt, as it conflicted with what they believed they were supposed to feel. Gratitude for survival existed alongside confusion about why life felt harder now. The men struggled to reconcile these emotions because acknowledging difficulty after release felt unjustified in a world that viewed freedom as resolution. As trust in their own reactions weakened, the men leaned further into caution, choosing safety over exploration and familiarity over growth. This pattern reinforced itself as limited engagement reduced opportunities to rebuild confidence, and reduced confidence further limited engagement. The cycle did not announce itself dramatically, but it shaped daily life through accumulation rather than crisis. By the end of this phase, the men understood that the challenge they faced was not simply reintegration, but the reconstruction of a self that could operate without constant reference to survival. The camp had not destroyed their identity, but it had reorganized it around endurance, leaving them to rediscover how to trust their own impulses in a world that no longer provided clear boundaries. Over time, the men began to recognize that the struggle they were experiencing was not a temporary phase that would resolve on its own, but a condition that had quietly settled into daily life. The expectation that normality would return gradually faded, replaced by an understanding that life would continue, but along a different internal path than the one they had imagined while waiting to go home. They learned how to function within this altered state, not by restoring what had been lost, but by adjusting to its absence. Days were organized carefully, energy was managed conservatively, and emotional exposure was limited because restraint had once protected them and still felt reliable. Life became manageable again, though not expansive, structured around stability rather than growth. The men noticed that they no longer measured progress by ambition or achievement, but by the absence of disruption. Calm became the primary goal, and anything that threatened balance was avoided quietly. This approach did not bring fulfillment, but reduced internal friction, allowing life to proceed without constant strain. Relationships adapted to this new rhythm, becoming narrower but more controlled. The men maintained connection where possible, yet rarely allowed themselves to engage deeply enough to risk disorientation. Intimacy required vulnerability, and vulnerability felt dangerous in a world that no longer provided clear boundaries for safety. They understood that the camp had taught them how to endure without expectation, and that lesson remained active long after release. What had once been a survival strategy became a permanent orientation toward life, shaping how they responded to uncertainty, opportunity, and change. The future was approached cautiously, not as a place to build toward, but as something to be navigated carefully. This realization did not lead to bitterness or despair, but to acceptance, because acceptance required less energy than resistance. The men stopped waiting for a moment when everything would feel resolved, and instead focused on maintaining equilibrium within the limits they now recognized. Life did not return to what it had been, but it became something sustainable. By the end of this phase, It was clear that freedom had not restored them to a previous version of themselves, but had required them to live forward with a reshaped inner world. The camp no longer defined their days, yet its influence remained embedded in how they moved through life, quiet and persistent. And so they carried on, not as men who had fully recovered, but as men who had learned to survive once and then learned more slowly how to live within what survival had left behind. Returning did not restore what had been paused, because life had continued without waiting, and the men were asked to rejoin it without instructions. The camp was behind them, yet the habits it had taught remained present, shaping how they chose, how they hesitated, and how they protected themselves from uncertainty. What followed was not a dramatic collapse, but a quieter adjustment, where endurance gave way to restraint and stability mattered more than expansion. Freedom did not undo the damage, but it revealed it, asking for skills that survival had never required. And so the men moved forward carefully, carrying a life that continued, even if it never fully returned, learning that the hardest part of the war was not the time spent waiting behind fences, but the long work of living afterward without them. Thank you for spending this time here. If these quiet, true World War II stories matter to you, subscribing helps this channel continue.